Litmus, the atheist, agnostic and agnostic allow for potentialities of anything holding a coherent definition and observation base, not a conclusion or belief. The nihilist, atheist, does not. The nihilist tries to employ the atheist defense, that nihilist atheism is also lack of belief, so therefore it is not a religion. All of this is a sleight of hand deception, as nihilist atheism is an extreme fundamentalist belief set. However, we as beings are always free to choose morality and decisions as we may find meaning.
Whatever. This is getting tiresome. And tempts me to end the video right here. That's right. Here we are right at the beginning of part 3, and already I'm thinking about ending the video right here. Don't try me. Because you just seem to keep repeating yourself over and over, using different words and scheming ploys. And then I have to do the same in response. This whole article seems to be sleight of hand deception, aimed at playing musical chairs with definitions. Nihilism acknowledges potentiality as the fundamental principle of reality, so none of that is true. And if it is, it's more of a symptom of modern atheism than nihilism. Get over it.
Romanticist nihilism. No, not fundamentalist nihilism. A ridiculous theoretical minority crafted to make atheists feel better about themselves, but nihilism nonetheless. Lots of fancy window dressing to make it all acceptable to both the observer and the wearer, but nihilism still.
You don't state anything significant with this sentence. The notion of romanticist nihilism is an oxymoron idea, as the idea of satiated hunger or conformist revolutionary. So now you're going to try to make some point with the distinction between romantic and fundamental nihilism. Fine, let's hear it.
Nihilism as a philosophy. Fundamental or existential nihilism. 1. There exist no theoretical domain sets regarded as a value or a order statement family, neither dependent to a culture, man or entity of reference, nor independent of them.
Any such theoretical domain sets regarded as value, as ought or ought not, are solely dependent on the existential agency to determine such value, and any extension of such into a culture or social structure reflect the same truth. They are still determined by a subject, even if adopted by a group.
1. Strong. There cannot exist such a value or values.
They don't exist literally, as they are not self-sustaining projections that have some kind of actual location in some linear setting that has any kind of substantiality independent of awareness. They exist momentarily in the now of awareness, to the agency that is supplying them the investment which defines them as such.
This is the nihilism which Nietzsche laments as not a practical art. In his comment, a nihilist is a man who judges that the real world ought not to be, and that the world as it ought to be, does not exist. According to this view, our existence, action, suffering, willing, feeling, have no meaning. This, in vain, is the nihilist's pathos, an inconsistency on the part of the nihilists.
Nietzsche was projecting his own psychology onto the philosophy, which stemmed from a considerable amount of anxiety over its implications. Nietzsche was very worried about nihilism, and it's understandable, for Nietzsche had his own attachments and investments just like anybody else. So it's not going to be easy to swallow, or cause a disposition that's not fraught with angst. Who is Nietzsche to declare what a nihilist is or isn't when he clearly is not even sure what nihilism is, other than just an anxiety-fueled opinion that more reveals what he personally feared or found depressing? It's not that the real world ought not be. The real world doesn't really exist anywhere to begin with. And if this is the case, then there's no sense in even considering what ought not be existing, for what is isn't even existing. And of course, Nietzsche goes on to further mischaracterize by saying that meaning itself is being denied by nihilism when it's clearly not, but only acknowledged as existent as it could be acknowledged, existentially and in the moment by a subject. The whole life being in vain thing as a nihilist pathos is a questionable charge by Nietzsche also, not being entirely certain if this assertion is the result of his actual interactions or just based on his own conclusions regarding his own attachment-prone perspective that deemed the non-substantial transience, aka the futility and impermanence, as a depressing notion. This is something every man has to grapple with, and represents the nihilistic crossroads of existentiality and absurdism. I don't find the prospect of no objective meaning, value, or purpose as depressing, nor the notion that everything and anything I could ever do or say amounts to nothing in the end. There is no end. These are only lamentable pathos when one is heavily tied up in investing importance into the idea of objectivity, which is a prime example of romanticism.
2. There exists the possibility of a complete or partial nothingness to aspects of the world.
It's not really so much a possibility as it is a potentiality. And potentiality doesn't exist, but manifests existence.
2. Strong. There cannot exist any state but nothingness, outside of that which is repeatably observable and consistently measurable.
Nothingness isn't a state. It's a superposition. And from this, an existence is produced. Once existential existence is in play, then observations and measurements are a possibility.
Nihilist romanticism. Unu picior.
However, as Nietzsche cites, fundamental nihilism is moot, as we not only may choose, but without exception have chosen as a mandate, to artificially construct such value sets as the conscious will of our skeptical, empirical and scientific collective thought might deem acceptable. This renders fundamental nihilism moot.
This seems like flawed reasoning that is reaching for something that it can't quite put its finger on. I'm not sure where you even got these labels of fundamental and romantic nihilism from, beyond possibly being terms that you have just simply pulled out of your ass. I don't see how being aware that one creates value based on whatever criteria renders this notion of fundamental nihilism as moot. Why? Because of a lack of an objective quality? I like how this author can write this entire article and yet never once mention objectivity or subjectivity. This is an indication that he's missing a major chunk of the argument, which explains why he's not able to connect certain dots.
1. The strong question of whether such values can exist or not is moot.
Moot to who, and by what standard? Values can exist, but they exist subjectively. And whether or not it's moot or not is also a subjective matter.
2. However, the applicability of the validity of nothingness as a basis of verity for our metaphysical or ontological reality is moot in a social discourse because the social discourse already assumes the impotence of such an argument.
If someone has decided or assumed the argument has importance, then for them it has importance and isn't moot. Are you intentionally using language to be deliberately glib while saying absolutely nothing?
2. The mandatory state of nothingness for that which is not under a consensus of repeatability and measurability is an a priori decision which may be adopted as per 1.
Saying nothingness is mandatory is your own declaration and isn't based on any argument put forth by a genuine nihilist. What's the matter? Did someone drench you with a nothingness squirt gun? Aw, poor baby.
3. Immaterial to 1. There can exist a personal ontological principle of existential nihilism as an optional subset of nihilist romanticism. the personal regard that life has no inherent meaning must be adjudicated in terms of objective application of its tenets in social discourse. The term meaning must be defined in a context before applicability can be determined.
So you determine all these rules, do you? So there can exist a personal ontological principle of existential nihilism as an optional subset of nihilist romanticism, just because you have decided to frame things in such a way based on definitions and classifications you yourself have created as an argumentative prop to bolster your contentions? How nice of you. And why must the truth of subjective meaning be judged in terms of objective application of its tenets in social discourse, just because you declare it? That might be difficult since there really is no such thing as objective application by any definition of the word objective. As far as defining the term meaning, that shouldn't be too much of an issue, as it isn't really what one would describe as an ambiguous word.
3. Therefore the argument reverts back to the definition of the term meaning in this, then merges existential nihilism back into the primary thematic definition being supported. The domain sets are chosen, and almost all relate to meaning.
Here's a definition of meaning. What is meant by a word, text, concept, or action?
Nihilism is defined as romanticist. 1. In basis in that we choose those as sets of domain to value, and strong metaphysical. 2. As we choose those as sets of domain to exclude as non-existent. Finally, these domain sets are often then based on existential meaning.
Only you are defining nihilism as romanticist, no one else is. And I guess that this is based on meaning being subjective and a standard to determine something's existence. Somehow you find this romantic.
3. Therefore, the practical social application of nihilism resides solely inside the context of nihilist romanticism with an accommodation for strong metaphysical nihilism, as fundamental, existential and weak metaphysical nihilism cannot deliver components of value or clarity in a social functioning or epistemological context.
Again, according to you. How you can come to this conclusion is perplexing. Existential nihilism has no need to deliver components of value or clarity in a social functioning or epistemological context. It's not that it cannot, but that it isn't necessary.
Axiom 1. All nihilists are nihilist romanticists and strong metaphysical nihilists, by practical default.
This isn't a truth, but just a declarative statement made from the narrow reasoning of a subject, who then calls this a practical default. So this is why it's humorous that you are even referring to these statements as axioms, since they are certainly not statements that are so evident or well established that they are accepted without controversy or question. I myself am calling into question the validity of your entire argument.
Axiom 2. Whether or not one is an existential nihilist is irrelevant except in terms of the adjudication of meaning, pseudo-scientific decision process.
It's irrelevant because you said so, right? I would say your lack of understanding of existential nihilism is the major weakness of your argument, which is why you so desperately want to dismiss it, or to downgrade it to a role of irrelevance or insignificance. Existential nihilism is the backbone of the philosophy, and obviously is the aspect of nihilism that is the fly in your ointment.
Axiom 3. The claim that nihilism consists exclusively of fundamental, existential and or weak metaphysical nihilism is a strawman fallacy and fallacy of composition.
No one is making such claims, but even if one was, it wouldn't be as you describe. But now you must really be getting desperate, for you're starting to reach into the old fallacy bag. Straw man? Are you serious? That's funny because this is the bulk of your arguments here. Assigning a bunch of positions, definitions, and conclusions to nihilism that no nihilist is really asserting and then arguing against it. Fallacy of composition. Well, you go further into depth on that one. So let's continue.
Axiom 4. To claim personal exemption from nihilism through the rejection of simply one or a few of its tenets constitutes special pleading and or a fallacy of compositional exclusion.
Yeah, this is a straw man because no one is doing that. I don't see nihilists claiming personal exemptions, making special pleadings, or rejecting tenets, of which does not even apply since there are no tenets. But go on.
In other words, were I a practitioner and member of the Muslim faith, yet I made the personal claim to not be a Muslim, and justified this by citing that I did not support Shia Islam, or I did not adhere to one of the 5 pillars of the faith, the testimony of the faith, fervent prayer, giving of the zakat, support of the needy, fasting during the month of Ramadan, and the pilgrimage to Mecca once in a lifetime, I would be making several errors. First, I would commit a fallacious claim of special pleading in order to leverage my preference in tenets to stand as self-representation in denial of being a Muslim, were I to claim that all Muslims must only be Shia, in order to exclude myself from its broader categorization. I have made a fallacy of compositional exclusion. Most honest religious Abrahamists will not undertake such a deception on their part. However, a dishonest nihilist will claim when challenged that they are not a nihilist, and moreover will conceal this reality under a shroud of philosophical atheism as both a protection and promotion vehicle for their religion.
What's probably really happening here is that you are falsely and incorrectly labeling modern atheists as nihilists, and they are denying being so. So you've chalked this off as a compositional fallacy, but it isn't, since these atheists are not really nihilists. But you want them to be in your own mind, so as to try and salvage atheism as you think it should be, while deflecting all the atheist bullshit you don't like onto nihilism. Nice try, but fail.
Therefore, the primary definition of nihilism is correct, and is the only practical definition of nihilism: negation of one or more of the reputedly meaningful or non-material aspects of life, socially enforced metaphysical or pseudo-scientific naturalism.
The definition of nihilism is the negation of one or more reputedly meaningful aspects of life. Again, you added non-material aspects of life and socially enforced metaphysical or pseudoscientific naturalism to suit your own selfish purposes.
Nihilism as a religion. 2 features convert this philosophical nihilism into the more commonly applied religion of nihilism. A. I choose to reject categorically one or more concepts of ontological or existential meaning, which are generally recognized as cultural, ephemeral, difficult to observe, occulted or of possible enlightenment upon mankind. B. I contend without merit that our broader culture should also reject these concepts, based on an external standard reference of rationality, evidence, higher acumen, sanity or science.
This is exactly why you want to sweep existential nihilism under the carpet, or paint it out to be some special pleading exemption, or compositional fallacy, because without such a dismissal, your entire argument is invalid. Nihilism doesn't categorically reject concepts of ontological or existential meaning. It simply defines them as they are, relative and subjective. What's so hard to figure out about this? And nihilism isn't asking the culture at large to reject these concepts, only to discover the truth about them based on internal investigation, not externalizations.
Once one has made the decision to reject the meaningful aspects of life which others hold dear, in absence of an empirical backing and basis to this decision, one has become a nihilist. Now I may not choose to venerate the Buddha or the Tao, there are no gods in the Tao, but that does not make me a nihilist, as this may simply constitute a religious preference. However, if I reject the notion of any form of our spiritual plane or existence, or the possibility of enlightenment expanding beyond that which the corporeal mind can measurably elicit, then I have adopted a non-preferential exclusion of an aspect of meaning. I have adopted a tenet of nihilism.
If there is any label that would most exemplify the philosophy as fundamental nihilism, it would be existential nihilism, that which you try to minimize to some minor role. Since there isn't any God out there, whether because there isn't any evidence, or because one has a lack of an allowance, or an absence of belief, or however else you want to say it, then there isn't any objective force out there supplying meaning. Especially since reality is only a reality due to an awareness of such, of which supplies ample empirical backing and basis to any such decision to not accept meaning that has been presented to consider from that which is other than from one's own facilities. I am free to create my own meanings, and other people are free to create their own meanings. Now, you mentioned the Buddha and the Tao, and demonstrate a little bit of ignorance here by implying that choosing not to venerate them is not nihilism, but simply a religious preference. And even though what's called Buddhism and Taoism were never really meant to be religions, and were first and foremost philosophies of empirical existence, which were later converted into religions by dogma heads who, apparently to your delight, adopted someone else's meanings and values, despite the philosophies themselves imploring people not to do this, and to instead go out and find out for oneself, the exploration of which led to many nihilistic conclusions about reality, and yet at the same time call the rejection of any spirituality or enlightenment that one has not yet experienced for themselves as an adoption of non-preferential exclusion of an aspect of meaning, which, by your reasoning, is a tenet of nihilism. No. The nihilist understands that, in the absence of objectivity, that which is most real, present, clear, and self-evident is that which puts one in the position to even be able to question a so-called reality. And that since this agency is what facilitates the possibility of consideration in the first place, then this is the area of concern to be explored. Existential nihilism, which is what could be most accurately described as fundamental nihilism.
Nihilists are reluctant to acknowledge that science remains mute on avenues of research inside or around which very little measurement can be affected. This does not mean that science has categorically rejected any idea which it cannot measure or influence. It simply has maintained the discipline of the epocha mutis position. It has nothing to say on the matter. Science is ethically skeptical. Nihilists are not.
Nah. No, nihilists are not reluctant to acknowledge that science keeps an open mind and remains mute on matters that it cannot yet address. The nihilist is mostly indifferent to whatever science is doing, since, unlike science, nihilists are even skeptical about science in the medium of materialism itself.
A nihilist enacts a religious practice once he or she has implied, stated or sought to have others infer, as compulsory, that science has vetted their personal choice to reject a categorical concept of meaning, through rigorous empirical bases. If I personally lack a belief in any such a thing as God, in any form of definition that is a personal philosophy of atheism, if I personally have no idea as to whether or not God exists, in any form of definition that is a personal philosophy of agnosticism, if I personally contend that science has no definition for God, and find it irrelevant whether or not anyone rejects any or all chosen definitions of such, then that is a personal philosophy of agnosticism. If I tell people they are stupid if they believe in anything which I do not agree has been physically verified or measured, and attack and ridicule them, if I insist that only the measurable exists, that is nihilism. This is a religion. It contains processes of control by dictation of authorized thinking, and the desire to intimidate persons and constrain science as to what is appropriate to be measured. It is a grand folly. Don't listen to what a nihilist says in their propaganda. Watch how they apply it in their philosophy. The veneer is about 1 millimeter deep.
No, that isn't nihilism. That's asshole modern atheism. Embrace it. Be it. Live it. And stop trying to redress this asshole movement into nihilism.
Therefore, the three personal philosophies of atheism, agnosticism and agnosticism are generally not regarded to constitute religions. They are personal philosophical choices. A faking nihilist will also cite this logic and apply the martial art of theocratic dance, hide inside the terminology above, hoping to enjoy the luxury of protection afforded a personal ethic. But in reality, a faking nihilist cannot resist the temptation to then sell the religion they are dying to intimidate you into accepting, one which is concealed behind the innocent term above, as they will immediately and always step into the perfidious activity below.
Since what you are describing is in fact modern asshole atheism, and not nihilism at all, then by your own charge and your own reasoning, modern atheism is a religion. Thank you for clarifying that.
The tenets of religious nihilism, any or all of the following. If, however, I personally reject the notion that there is such a thing as God in any definition and imperiously contend that rationality, science, sanity, evidence or hierarchyman has proved this out, I have exaggerated the claims of science in order to intimidate you into accepting my position. This is a practice of religious nihilism.
No. This is modern atheism. Nihilism at least allows for the existence of a theological God as an inventory item of a persona's thoughts. No, this isn't a matter of by any definition, for atheism argues against a clearly defined notion of God, the one supreme being, the creator and ruler of the universe. This implies a deity that exists on its own, has created everything, knows everything, and rules over everything. No one is saying they can't prove a God doesn't exist, but only that there is a lack of evidence for it. Take that same sentence and replace God with flying pink elephants. Does it still carry the same impact you imagined? If, however, I personally reject the notion that there is such a thing as a flying pink elephant in any definition, and imperviously contend that rationality, science, or higher acumen has proved this out, I have exaggerated the claims of science in order to intimidate you into accepting my position. You see how silly this is? Maybe there are flying pink elephants existing somewhere out there in the universe, but as of right now, there is no evidence for it. You can't suspend a solid conclusion based on evidence or a lack thereof, based on a notion that it can't be proven absolutely. Otherwise, you can't build basic knowledge about the laws of the context we exist in. Next, you list off 17 items that you claim nihilism rejects. And most of them have to do with pseudoscience, the paranormal, UFOs, mystical creatures, alternate morals, the afterlife, etc. And I won't bother with addressing each one, but we'll try to wrap this up with a summation. You don't know what nihilism is. And welcome to the club. You have some attachment to the identification of atheists, but you don't like what atheism has become. So you are trying to create a distinction where there really is none. Just accept that there are many schisms in atheism and remedy it how you wish. But don't try to lie and reassign everything you don't like about atheism onto nihilism, which is indifferent to atheism, theism, science, and materialism. Atheism's intolerance is its own problem, and nihilism wants nothing to do with it. You say that the practice of any or all non-scientific means of controlling or influencing others, or establishing a culture of hate around people who do not adhere to this, is a religion, plain and simple, and that this religion is just as deadly and murderous as the Abrahamic religions after which it molded itself? Fine. So then now you know what atheism has become. No wonder you are an atheist that denies that you are an atheist. Nihilism isn't ashamed of anything, and if a nihilist denies he's a nihilist, it's because, just like everything else, nihilism doesn't really exist. other than as an existential philosophy that doesn't give a shit about what you believe or what you want to research. Go for it. Knock yourself out. Whether it be God, science, beliefs, concepts, value, purpose, meaning, narrative, mystical creatures, or anything else in the material universe, real or imagined, nihilism doesn't invest in any of it, but rather recognizes it for exactly what it is. Layer upon layer of empty, illusory arrangements of appearances that delude the consciousness into forgetting that it is the source of all these reflected projections. That about wraps it up, chum.